Hello, and welcome to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, How America Culture Came to Be, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel.
Since the museum is a museum of immigration, and usually when you talk about immigration, you always talk about push factors that are making people want to leave a place and pull factors that are going to make people want to get to the place. One of the most important things, though, is means. You can't get from point A to point B. You're never going to get to point B. So now we are going to talk about the transatlantic trade and ships. And we have Mark with us.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got interested or involved with shipping and boats and so on and so forth?
I have a master's degree in public history from SUNY Albany. And while I was doing my internship up at Saratoga National Battlefield, I fell in love with historic interpretation. And really, after I was done with school, I ended up looking for a job as a historic interpreter. And I ended up eventually working at Jamestown Settlement, working on the ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, as one of the historic interpreters. Now, I grew up in Florida, learning about the Spanish Empire and the trade and the Spanish galleons and the war against Spain and England with Sir Francis Drake's raid at St. Augustine back in the 1580s. So I grew up with learning a bit about that part of the history. So just being able to work on the ships was great and was really able to add in to that general knowledge about the trade and the empire building that was going on in the colonial period, added in a lot of the ship-specific stuff, learning about navigation and how the nuts and bolts of these ships actually going across the Atlantic crossing. I ended up working out on the ships for more than 10 years before I ended up eventually making my way here to the Frontier Culture Museum.
And the first question we have is really a simple one. What is the difference between a ship and a boat?
Okay, so ship and a boat, there's a number of different ways that people have traditionally viewed the difference between the two. One that was pretty common in the period is a ship is going to be moving under its own power. A boat can actually be put on a ship. Generally speaking, a ship also is a vessel that is capable of the Atlantic crossing, where boats generally could not make that voyage. It was not able to carry enough supplies, and it did not have the kind of propulsion, enough sails and rigging to be able to get it across the Atlantic Ocean.
So what kind of ships are you talking about would be available?
All right, so when we're talking about the different styles of ships, throughout the age of the transatlantic trade, they go through a couple of different variations. The very first is a Portuguese ship known as a caravel. Caravel is taking some of the best parts of the Mediterranean shipping traditions and adding them into the Northern European shipping traditions. As an example, with the sails. In Northern Europe, big square sails, giving driving power for ships, is going to be very common. But in the Mediterranean, there's a triangular sail, a lateen sail, which is going to be a far more common sail. It helps with maneuverability as well as a little bit of propulsion for the ship. The Portuguese are going to take that, add new Northern European ribbing to the inside of the ship. That's the framework of the boat. It's like a human body, where the keel is the spine, the ribs attached to it, and then the hull of the ship is on the outside. That is stabilized and made stronger. It's also going to allow these ships to add gun ports to the sides of the ships going forward. And the caravels are going to be the first ships that really do that in a meaningful way. Then they're going to add the big square sails of the Northern European ships and the lateen mizzen sail, the triangular sail at the aft, the back part of the ship, which is going to aid in the steering, and another sail called the sprit sail at the front, which is another square sail to add counterweights and balances to the ship. So they make this all very complicated, but they balance it out. And it's going to with the caravel, which is two of the ships that Columbus used were caravels across the Atlantic Ocean. By the middle of the 1500s, the Spanish have gotten their hands on this caravel design, and they add more ribbing, they expand the ship so the ships can get bigger, and now you have a vessel that can carry hundreds, thousands of tons of cargo across the Atlantic Ocean. The caravels are still in use, but the galleon becomes the principal ship of the age. Then, with the marriage of Mary of England and Philip of Spain, they gift the galleon design to the English. And the English then modify this design of ship to become the raise-built galleon. And from that point on, you're really looking at Dutch and English ship innovation continuing through the late 15, 16, and 1700s, where you're going to see not just a single holistic design being used for both merchant ships and warships, but you'll actually see a divide between where you'll see the Dutch merchant vessel becomes a very distinct vessel, round, doesn't carry guns anymore, but can hold a third more cargo than a galleon. And then they'll create smaller warships, which will be turned into the first frigates. And that'll become the design going for the smaller warships. The big war galleons, with the English hold on to a little bit longer than the Dutch or anybody else, will eventually start morphing into the man-of-wars and the ships of the line that you start seeing during the Napoleonic War, where you can see ships that have over 100 guns on them by the time you get to 1800. And that would have been unthinkable back in Columbus's day in 1492.
We all know that Columbus is the one who made it to North America first, allegedly. There was quite a few people who think there were quite a few more people who made it before Columbus. What was unique about Columbus?
So Columbus's trip across the Atlantic Ocean is important in a couple of ways, but the really big one, as opposed to the earlier voyages of the Vikings, when Columbus got back, he told everybody about him making it across the ocean. Now, he was mistaken in thinking that he had made it to near China. He thought he had made it all the way across, and he was in Asia. But he did get back, and he talked about islands that had a number of different natural resources, different materials, which enticed the Spanish government to fund 3 more voyages for Columbus to get across the Atlantic Ocean. The other issue is that after Columbus makes his first voyage, Europeans never stop going across the Atlantic Ocean after that, and will begin the age of colonization.
Is one of the reasons that Columbus made his journey is the way to get spices from the Indians was cut off by the Ottomans?
Right. Okay, so in the year 1415, the Ottoman Empire is beginning to gobble up large parts of Anatolia. And by 1453, the city of Constantinople, now Istanbul, was conquered by the Ottoman Turks. Within the next several decades, the Turks are going to push down through what we call the Middle East today into Egypt. And at that point, the Ottomans have pretty much a monopoly on the Silk Road, the trade coming from China all the way into Europe. And they're able to dole out monopolies to their Italian trading partners, raising the prices of goods like pepper, different oriental spices, silks, into Europe, goods that the Europeans had become dependent on and had become accustomed to being able to get at fairly reasonable prices. At the far end of that trade, countries like England, Spain, Portugal, and France are starting to feel the economic pinch as their money is flowing into Italy and into the Ottoman Empire. And that is what will originally encourage the Portuguese and then later the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English to begin looking for alternative routes to China and the Spice Islands. The Portuguese are first as they begin sailing south, trying to get around the tip of Africa, which they're going to be able to accomplish at the end of the 1400s. It's a large part of them making it around the south tip of Africa why Portugal actually passes on funding the Columbus expeditions going across the Atlantic Ocean, which Spain, after 1492, will pick up.
How long did it take Columbus, and did the innovation in boat design that you just talked about increase the speed going across the Atlantic?
It does increase the speed going across the Atlantic, but there are limits to how much extra speed you can get out of the ships. The transatlantic winds only go so fast, so there is a kind of a limit to how fast these ships can go. But to give an example, it's going to take ships like Columbus, or even a later vessel like the first colonists at Jamestown. It took them almost 4.5 months to get across the Atlantic Ocean. It's then going to become much closer to 6 weeks to get from, say, Boston to London during the time of the American Revolution. there are two major things. One, the ships have become more streamlined so that they are getting more consistent top speeds, say at around 10 to 12 knots being somewhat common. That's 10 or 12 nautical miles per hour. But on the other hand, you are going to be seeing them be able to sail into the wind more effectively. When Columbus or the sailors on the first Jamestown expedition were sailing across, they really had to follow the wind currents across, which comes down from Europe towards West Africa. From about where the Cape on West Africa is, it swings across through the South Atlantic, up through the Caribbean, and then the wind currents tend to shatter in the Caribbean, and the number of different wind currents kind of zigzag through. If you've ever watched hurricanes, you know how chaotic that can be. Right off the coast of Florida, the wind currents and water currents all come back together and come up the coast of the modern United States, up to about Virginia to New York, at which point they begin swinging back across to Europe and then continue and finish the circle. So it's a big circle going across the Atlantic Ocean, with a big dead zone, the doldrums, in the middle, which you don't want to end up in because you could get stuck there for quite a while before the next breeze showed up. By the time you're looking at the Revolutionary or the Napoleonic era, those ships are now able to sail above the northern route, going north of the trade winds, and are able to zigzag through a series of mini currents and be able to get across and arrive in New England in 6 weeks. Although it was still generally a better idea for coming to Virginia or the southern colonies to go that longer route around. It also gave you a chance to trade in West Africa and the Caribbean and bring goods both from Europe as well as those other parts of their colonial empires and other places into the colonies here in America.
So you're talking about obviously very complicated navigation. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the navigation worked?
All right, so this is going to bring us back to the Portuguese. There was a gentleman by the name of Prince Henry the Navigator, is what we as historians tend to call him. He was a prince of Portugal, and he basically brought together a number of navigators, mathematicians, to figure out how to do navigation across the Atlantic Ocean. And there are a number of different techniques. The first one is the one that the Europeans had previously been using. It's a technique called piloting. Piloting is honestly what we tend to do a lot when we're traveling. You know that you're going to be going down a road until you see a certain store, and then you know to make a right. You're using landmarks from one landmark to the next landmark to get to where you want to go. The Europeans were doing this to sail the coastal waters of Europe. That's also how they're going to be using cues from what the topography is giving you on how they're going to begin mapping and exploring the New World when they first arrive here. The second technique is a process called dead reckoning or deduced reckoning. Dead reckoning needs a couple of instruments. You first need a magnetic compass. The second, you need to figure out a way to measure the ship's speed. And that's going to be a tool called a chip log. Chip log is a large piece of wood about the size of a torso with a small lead weight on the bottom. It's attached to a rope on a wooden spool. And the rope is pre-measured out with different knots tied into the ropes. The way it was done in the 1600s was it was about 42 feet apart, which is about 120th of a nautical mile. So they're doing it mathematically. The maps are set to the same scale. You throw the chip log off the back part of the ship, and you let it run out for 120th of an hour, which is 30 seconds. At the end of that, you count the knots, and that will give you the approximate speed of the ship. And you know, based on your compass heading, I'm heading west, and the speed, you'll know that you'll be getting to your destination at a certain point, basically. The other part of that, of course, is you need to know where you started from. So if you know you're starting from London, you can plot out every 30 minutes exactly the trip you're taking. The third part of the puzzle is a technique called celestial navigation. Celestial navigation is using the sun and the stars to find one's way across. The two most important of those is going to be, of course, the sun, and at night, it's, in the northern hemisphere at least, the North Star. And in the southern hemisphere, it's going to be eventually developed into the Southern Cross. So the idea for celestial navigation, we're going to work with the sun primarily because that was pretty much universal for everybody. So at what's called local apparent noon, you're going to take your navigation beam. When you look at a clock today, it's not actually noon. It's the average of all the noons of our year for what's directly above your head. Now, the navigators, when they first do this, and I'm sorry for everyone who's a science major, they got the science wrong. So let's imagine the science is wrong. The Earth does not move. We know it moves. But they didn't when they first were figuring this out. So they imagined the Earth as a stationary object. And the sun circled around the Earth. We know this is wrong today. But it makes the math a lot easier. And so what you do is you use geometry to calculate what the angle of the equator going out into the universe. Just imagine it's a big straight line. For everyone that took geometry, we've just created a plane. And now the sun moves north and south of that plane throughout the course of the year. And it never goes above a certain point, Tropic of Cancer, and it never goes below a certain point, the Tropic of Capricorn. And therefore, you can measure that angle every day of the year, and you'll be able, without any kind of variation, be able to figure it out for about a decade. That gets written down in a chart of declination. The sailor doesn't have to figure out any of this math. A mathematician has done it for them. Now all you have to do is keep an eye basically on the sun until it looks to stop rising in the sky and just kind of sits there. That's local noon. Now you take your navigational tool, and there's a variety of them. And what you're going to do is you're going to measure the angle between the horizon to the sun, and from the sun straight up at the 90-degree angle, the zenith angle. That's what you want. And if you take that angle and you add it in with that declination reading, it gives you your latitude. And that's going to be something Columbus had with him on the trip across in 1492. Now, if you want to get, so we got latitude. If you want to get longitude, you're going to have to wait a while, because they tried for a couple centuries to figure out a sun reading or a star reading or a moon reading, or even using lunar and solar eclipses to try to figure out a mathematic formula to get longitude and latitude. But they figure out longitude finally once metallurgy and clockmaking can survive a trip on a ship. Once you get a clock that can survive the rigors of the salt air and the rocking of the ship, you now have the chronometer. And you set the chronometer to a standardized place. Greenwich, England is the place typically used. And that clock is set to Greenwich time. And the farther you sail away, you're eventually going to get that your noon with the sun is different than the noon that your clock is telling you. The difference in that is your latitude. So between both latitude and longitude, you are now able to plot a course across the Atlantic Ocean and get pretty close to what you want as your destination. Then you go back to piloting using landmarks to zero in so that you can arrive at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And from there, up the rivers to get to Colonial Williamsburg, Philadelphia, New York, or what you want as your destination.
What is some of the first things that they were taking from the New World to the Old World in trade?
All right. So once they first start the trade, they, of course, were looking for spices from the Orient. What they find are going to be tropical woods, and they're going to find gold. It's initially going to be fairly small deposits of gold they find in the Caribbean, but it's going to fuel specifically the Spanish quest for gold. And that's going to be the driving impact to get the Spanish Empire into the New World. But when the British start setting up their colonies here in the New World, they never find gold. So they're going to be looking at, and by that point, they have shifted the economy to looking at an idea of raw materials of moderate to even low value, leaving the colonies and being brought back to England. Those goods then get produced into a finished product, which they can then sell back to the colonists or sell over to their trade partners in Europe. So in the southern colonies, rice and indigo are going to be major products. Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, tobacco is going to be a major product. You're going to see wheat. You're going to see in the middle colonies, you're going to see molasses, fish from the northern colonies. All the colonies are going to be trading in timber. Timber is a hugely important product for Europe. They're running low on wood. And so either having wooden planks and boards made in the colonies and then shipped over to be used in ship production is going to be something that's used. It's never profitable, but it's a pretty consistent product going on. You also see iron and other goods coming out of the colonies being sent back to Europe. So that's what you're looking at for the 13 colonies. As you go further south in the Caribbean, sugar. Sugar is going to be the primary driver of Caribbean colonies for most of the era. It's going to be turned into sugar for food production. It's going to be turned into an alcoholic beverage, which becomes known as rum. And you're going to see that become the major products out of those colonies. You're going to see that continuing all the way down into Brazil. The sugar, the tobacco, these are heavily invested in labor. You need lots and lots and lots of people to be able to do that. And in the early years, they were able to bring the labor over with indentured servants. As time went on, that was not sufficient for the demand for these goods. And that's when the European colonies are going to start turning to the African slave trade to make up the shortfall in that labor and start bringing slaves to the New World.
When was the first sugar, or when did they first start growing sugar in the Caribbean?
Oh, so there's going to be a number of different answers for that, but you're going to start seeing it in the early 1500s. You'll start seeing some sugar plantations, but by the 1600s, it's really taken off to become the principal crop coming out of the Caribbean. That also ties in with the rise of the slave trade. In the 1500s, the slave trade starts off relatively slow, and it's building through the 1500s. And in the 16 and then further into the 1700s, you're going to kind of see a spike in the number of folks being brought over, enslaved, captured, and sold into slavery and brought across the Atlantic Ocean. Until you get to the end of the 1700s, where you are still seeing modern equivalent of millions and millions of dollars worth of sugar.
These big economic undertakings, were they controlled by anyone? Was there a conglomerate that would be in charge of this, or was it independent interests?
So the easy answer is yes. Some of these ventures are going to be funded and controlled by the governments. Say Columbus himself is working for Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. So some of these are royal initiatives. But for a lot of the countries of Europe, the governments don't possess enough money or the desire to sink so much of their money into these ventures. And so they turn to private business for a lot of them. We'll take Virginia as an example. Virginia actually starts as a privately owned joint stock company. Now, King James is a stockholder. He has a small sliver of the money that went in, but it's a very small sliver. Most of the money is being provided by a couple dozen individuals that are basically investors, pulling their money together, creating a stock company to make a profit in Virginia. When they don't generate enough money, they're then going to open it up on the open stock market. They had a stock market in London in the period, and they start buying and selling stocks to increase the money going into the company. Now, the Virginia company was never particularly profitable. Some of these same stockholders, though, do start up another company which does a lot better, and that's the East India Company of London. That company is going to, over its couple of centuries of existence, become larger than really any company we have around today. It's going to be for Americans, they're the guys that brought the tea over for the Boston Tea Party coming out of India. They also were involved with trade with China and all through India through the 17 and 1800s. But these companies are both a mix of private and public. And for England's case, they had to have royal permission to be able to operate in the spheres of influence they did. Now, the Spanish were actually willing to give commissions and trade deals to other foreign nations. And the Royal Africa Company of London became the de facto Spanish slave company in the early 1700s, when they got the commission to be able to bring slaves and sell them not just to the British colonies, but also sold them to the Spanish colonies like Cuba, Mexico, Peru. So it's going to be a little bit of mixing and matching but always with some government oversight.
Looking at trade early on, it's the Spanish and the Portuguese at first, and the English are bit players.
Correct.
And most of the time they're privateers, they're pirates. When do the British start dominating the trade? Because eventually, by the 18th century, they are going to dominate this trade.
So there's a couple of different phases of this. So 1500s, Spain and Portugal, it's their game. First English colony is Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. The French get into it in 1608 with Quebec. So you're going to start having these French and English colonies not long after, followed by Dutch colonies. And from there, we're going to have new players. Now, Spain and Portugal signed in the 1500s a treaty basically splitting the territory between them. And they viewed everybody else as intruders. So their governments were trying to stop these other colonial ventures. Now, by the time we get to, let's take England specifically, you're looking at, under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, in Europe, England and Spain are having tense political issues, which eventually in 1587 and 1588 break out into war between them. But Elizabeth of England had known that was a real possibility for more than a decade beforehand. And what she had been doing is she had been giving what are called letters of marque, letters of permission to English ship captains to go to the Caribbean and basically steal whatever they could get their hands on, whether that was by attacking Spanish shipping, attacking Spanish towns, or just smuggling goods in and out of the Caribbean, bringing sugar and gold back to England. In 1587, a legitimate English merchant fleet was detained by the Spanish government, basically to pay off all the pirating activity that the English had been involved in for the previous decade. And that's the inciting event that starts the English-Spanish War. That conflict and the privateering that the war created went from 1588 all the way to 1603. From that point on, after Elizabeth's death and a peace treaty signed between the English and the new English monarch, James I, ended that war. James I was much more hesitant to have privateering as a major focus of his government. However, that didn't change the fact that most of the rest of his government very much wanted to continue privateering. And so you had a number of lords that did provide some letters of marque, and England's, to that point, ally, the Dutch, now became the guarantors of those letters of permission. Now, the Dutch also were at war with Spain. The Dutch, well, they're not actually the Dutch yet. They are part of the Spanish Netherlands, and they are trying to get their independence. And they are in the midst of their war of independence, and the northern parts of what's now Holland end up going, trying to get the war, and they're more than happy to have English merchant ships and privateers attacking Spanish interest in the New World and bringing that wealth back into Europe. Basically, just as long as Spain's denied the materials, they're happy. So that's going to continue to fuel that. Now, after the death of Charles I, James I's son, and the English Civil War, there's a period where Oliver Cromwell becomes the dictator of England. And the privateer business is back and booming because they end up at war with Spain again. And this is going to be the war where Jamaica will end up in English control. And that becomes the base of operations, leaving places like Virginia no longer being a place where people might want to have gone for privateering. Now it's all based out of Jamaica. And it's attacking Spanish shipping. It's beginning to attack French shipping. As France is starting to get colonies, France is involved with this, attacking both English and Spanish shipping. All of them are attacking Portuguese shipping. Portuguese are attacking everybody except the English and the Dutch because they are trying to get political alliances with them. And that's really the important thing with letters of marque. Letters of marque tell you who you can attack, but it also tells you who you can't. If you are English, you cannot attack. You can only attack the people on your list. If it says Spain, you can only attack Spain. If it says Spain and France, you're good for both, but don't attack the Dutch. They're our friends. And then the Dutch get back into it. Now, after the Netherlands got its independence, they started up setting up colonies. They got into trade in a major way, and they became the rivals of England for trade as they're beginning to gobble up the old Spanish and Portuguese trade ports, beginning to take the trade value out of these other countries. Those countries, both the Dutch and the English, don't want privateers to continue. They start pushing down on privateering until by that time you get into the 1700s, privateering is mostly out of fashion by that point. You see it come up a couple of times in the early 1700s, but by then, the English, the Dutch, the French trailing behind have got a big enough naval presence to protect their merchant shipping that privateers are just not viable anymore.
I hear that under Cromwell and the English Republic, they passed the first Navigation Acts in 1651, I believe, and a lot of historians say that is the official start of the British Empire. Can you explain what they are and what they accomplished?
So, what the Trade Acts did was basically saying, if you are an English ship, you go and you do business in the colonies, you can only return to an English or later British port to sell your goods. And it's going to be a way to prevent, I'll pick on New York for a moment, who has originally a Dutch colony base. It's going to prevent a colony that's mostly Dutch in the early years from doing business with the Netherlands. They have to do business with the English. And so those are rules put in place. Now, depending on the decade we talk about, can talk about how much smuggling or not smuggling the American colonists did, especially in the northern colonies where they had ties to other trade networks like New York with the Dutch, or say Massachusetts, closer to Maine with the French, which are right next door. But they're not supposed to trade with these other people because of the Navigation Acts. Those Navigation Acts get renewed a couple of different times during the 1700s until we come right on up to the French and Indian War period and after the French and Indian War, where you're going to start seeing them transform not just into Navigation Acts being returned, but you start seeing more specific ones with things like the Sugar Act.
And isn't part of the Navigation Acts made a big push on increasing the amount of ships the English had? It started, and that helped New England dramatically.
It does. So England is already in an upward trajectory in their shipbuilding. I'm going to pick Queen Elizabeth again. When Queen Elizabeth took over the throne of England, she had 3 modern ships. When she left, she had a fleet that she was able to call together 150 strong to fight against the Spanish in the Third Armada invasion attempt. So England has already got themselves the shipbuilding capacity. Under the early Stuarts, James and Charles, and Cromwell, that shipbuilding capacity also turns towards their merchant ship ventures. And so 2 things are going to happen. The laws come on the books to encourage English shipping because the Dutch are outbidding them. They're winning the trade wars. And the second thing they do is they have an internal rework. England had put on the books that you could only build galleons. After the Navigation Acts came in, to encourage English shipbuilding locally and to increase trade, they actually acquiesced and they started copying the Dutch merchant ship designs. And between the 2 of them, it's really meant to build up England's economic base. And so right after that happens, there's another Anglo-Dutch war over trade. And from that point on, England's going to be building up its fleet larger and larger, and it kind of becomes an exponential growth. Now, it's actually become so large, that's where New England shipbuilding and Virginia shipbuilding come into the equation. There's too much shipping needed. It's not economical anymore to ship the wood across the Atlantic Ocean. So one of the things that they allow the colonists to start doing on the coast is building merchant vessels. New England is superior because of the types of wood that they have for building Atlantic-going merchant ships, fishing boats, whalers. And so Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut are going to begin those shipbuilding traditions for merchant vessels. Places like Virginia, they don't have access to the good, strong, mast quality woods. They have much softer timber here in the South. And as a result, they don't make as much in the transatlantic merchant ships, but a lot of the coastal trade vessels are actually being made in places like Philadelphia and being made further south, Charleston, Virginia. So that's what you're going to see kind of happen for that. And that does create shipbuilding industries here in the colonies.
Obviously, trade in items versus trade in people, very different kind of infrastructures, very different sorts of basically ship structures needed as well. Was there a reason certain groups devoted themselves to one or the other, or was one more profitable?
Oh, so there's a lot of different reasons for that. We're going to start with, do you remember the merchant trade companies? As a result of the Royal West African Trade Company, they can only deal with West African trade goods. So as a result, they are going to become heavily invested in the transatlantic slave trade. So therefore, they're going to have ships constructed for them with that trade in mind. Now, that wasn't the original goal of the company. The original goal was to get gold from Gold Coast, ivory from the Ivory Coast. Of course, when they started, England didn't have any real slave colonies. They're just starting to get them with Jamaica, Virginia, just starting to have tobacco become so labor heavy that they wanted more labor. Now the West African Trade Company gets into the Atlantic slave trade. So that's where you're going to start seeing the company shifting its priorities. Once it shifts its priorities, they're shifted. And now what they're doing is they're getting themselves trade ports along the coast of West Africa. They have trade deals associated with different African princes along the Ivory Coast and the Slave Coast. Those princes are raiding into the interior of Africa, capturing these folks as war prisoners, dragging them back to the coast, and then selling them to the Europeans, in this case the English, in exchange for European goods, principally guns and gunpowder. They're then put onto the ships. Now, there's two ways these ships end up getting modified for the transatlantic slave trade. One is known as loose packing, the other is known as tight packing. They're both horrendous. Imagine standing right next to another person and then scooch as close as you can so that you're head to toe with each other. And then put another couple of people right next to you and fill up an entire school bus that way, from top to bottom, with wooden planks in between so that the weight's not on top of everyone. And that's going to be what you're looking at for these ships conditions. They are horrendous. There's going to be a rising mortality rate, a death rate on the trip across the Atlantic Ocean. And the longer we look at the slave trade, the deeper into the era we go, the more and more horrendous those conditions become. All the way up to the 1800s. In the early 1800s, England actually is the first country to abolish the international slave trade. And then they give a small window of time before everybody else has to do it, or England's going to stop your ships. They pretty much say, we're going to stop every Atlantic-going slave vessel. That decade and a half, 2 decades or so period, is going to see an incredible spike in the importation of slaves. And that's going to create the most horrendous conditions on these slave ships. As you start seeing the Portuguese colonies in Brazil, some of the southern colonies, the Caribbean colonies in Cuba, until these places actually get their own independence, rising up until the early 1800s, at which point the English stopped the international slave trade. But just because the international slave trade was ended, did not end slavery in those parts of the world where it had been formed.
So once the Americans get their freedom, or even actually slightly before, is there some sort of push to establish their own relations separate from Britain as they know they're coming into war?
So for the British 13 colonies, as they're aging, as they're getting older colonies, they're actually starting to create their own kind of national identities. And as they start doing that, they're chafing under the British trade regulations. If you were under the Navigation Acts, if you were an English ship, and it was really only ships that were flying the flag of the King of England could go to the English colonies to purchase goods, and then they had to return to a port controlled by the British government. And so you start having a number of American colonists that start more and more smuggling. And that establishes those basic trade routes that they're going to then begin building upon once they've declared independence. In the earliest days, when they declare independence, the two principal groups they're looking towards are the Dutch and the Netherlands trade networks, and they're looking to France. Those are going to be their two primary driving factors to get goods to fight the American Revolution. Once the American Revolution ends, the United States is now pretty much free to do as it wishes, but it's in an economically pretty weak position to be on the trade network. So they're starting again pretty much from the bottom. And so they have to initially start setting up trade negotiations with their local neighbors. So they're going to start with Canada, the British colony to the north. They're going to start with New Spain, which will eventually develop into the independent nation of Mexico to their south. They're going to start with shipping. Now, they've had those merchant shipbuilding facilities in New England. That's going to become the core of American trade shipping and eventually war shipping production for the beginnings of the United States. That's going to allow them to get into trade both in West Africa, still bringing in slaves in the early years, going to be bringing in some ivory and gold, but it also is going to let them plug in to the collapsing Spanish Empire and Portuguese empires to the south. By this point, Spain is still one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, but they're not really running it anymore. It's mostly running itself just on inertia. And the Spanish don't have the capacity to control the regions that they have. And they're going to spend the next 120 years shedding their colonial empire, starting with places like Cuba and Spain and Mexico, and ending with places like the Philippines. So that's what you're going to be looking at. So as they start shedding, the Portuguese are going to have the same issue, where they actually are going to have the monarchy in Portugal flee to Brazil for a time and then go back. But those are going to become very loosely controlled compared to where they were in the 15 and 1600s at their heights. And so now the United States is beginning to bring in things like coffee and tropical hardwoods, sugar from Brazil, sugar and tobacco a little bit from the Caribbean. You're going to be seeing the United States starting to produce more and more of their own goods and selling iron materials, wood-based materials, fishing and all fishing-based products, whale oil. It's going to be collected by the United States and sold to those American colonies. James Monroe is even going to kind of codify that we don't, as a nation, want British colonial empires in the New World with the Monroe Doctrine. That is in large part about controlling trade in the New World. It's also about not wanting all of the different American territories to have independence. It's something that, as a newly independent country, the United States believed in, but it also wanted to get a handle on that almost all the New World trade, with really the only major exception being the British Empire. The British Empire was just too big and remained just too big for another 100 plus years. But the United States is going to become growing first with its trade, later on with its developing industrial capacity, more and more a major player in the economic sphere, until by the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century, the United States is really looking at, with maybe only Germany being the other example, major new emerging economic powers.
Well, thank you for being on the show, Mark. We hope you enjoy Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds. We bring you historical episodes twice a month. You can check out the Frontier Culture Museum on frontiermuseum.org or Facebook and Instagram. You'll find background information on all the farms at the museum, information on upcoming events, and so much more.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please consider visiting the website and clicking the donate button. Donations to the Frontier Culture Museum Foundation support field trips, summer camp, and special events.
We greatly appreciate it. See you next time.